All right. I think we're going to get started now as people filter in. A lot to get to today, a lot of really great resources to share. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the California School Board Association's webinar, The ABCs of UTK, Planning for Universal Transitional Kindergarten in Your District. My name is Jeremy Anderson. I'm an education policy analyst at CSBA, and I will be serving as your moderator today. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to note a few housekeeping items for the webinar. We are happy to be able to include a question and answer session at the end of this webinar. To facilitate your questions for our panelists, we ask that you please use the Q&A feature in Zoom and not the chat. Questions will either be answered in the Q&A box or live by our presenters at the end of all of their presentations, and we will try to get to as many as we can. Additionally, all attendees of this webinar will receive an email with a link to the video of the webinar, as well as the complete slide deck that you will see here today. We are very excited to welcome a panel of individuals who bring unique dimensions of expertise in a wide range of issues related to Universal Transitional Kindergarten. These panelists are here to discuss critical components of the state's efforts to expand access to early education to all 4-year-olds in California. Our presenters, in order of their presentation, are Sarah Neville Morgan, Deputy Superintendent of Public Instruction with California Department of Education, Dr. Bruce Fuller, Professor of Education and Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley, Abigail Slovic, doctoral student at the University of California, Berkeley, Dr. Stephanie Saminsky, the Director of Early Education Program and GATE at the San Diego Unified School District, Sandra Lee, Preschool Coordinator from Weaver Union School District, and Chris Reefe, the Legislative Director from CSBA. It is no secret that LEAs are working through significant challenges this school year and beyond, and we hope that this webinar will be able to provide you with guidance and resources to help make either expansion of an existing TK program or first-time implementation smoother. We are looking forward to sharing these resources with you today. Our first presenter, Sarah Neville Morgan, will introduce Universal Transitional Kindergarten in California. While this webinar focuses on transitional kindergarten as it relates to the governance role of board members, you may notice that it is part of a larger early education initiative and vision with such acronyms as UPK, Universal Pre-Kindergarten, and UTK, Universal Transitional Kindergarten, which Sarah will be touching on. So with that, I will turn it over to Sarah.
Thanks so much, Jeremy. So I want to start with the big overall picture. In that, as we go to the next slide, we look at transforming California's schools. So as you all probably know, we've had historic budget investments that really provide a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to address all of the various issues and opportunities to really transform California's educational landscape. So many of you might know that decades of research also show that developmental gaps between an app promise and young children and their peers begin early, and they grow through preschool as they come into TK and K, and really are those achievement gaps that we then see in our elementary and secondary schools, unless we have other ways to mitigate and create these learning opportunities, such as quality pre-K, and intervene early. So we want to emphasize this enormous or historic opportunity that is before us, that is coupled with those persistent challenges, and how we need all of your support to really take advantage of these opportunities and create the educational system that California's students and families need in 2020 and beyond, not the system from 1890 or 1950, or even from 2019, but really what do we need now and moving forward. So as you'll see in that slide, there were a variety of things that were invested in that create this historic investment opportunity that really coupled together several universals, UPK or universal preschool being one, but also universal meals, the nearly universal expanded learning programs, a huge nearly $3 billion investment in community schools, all of these pieces, and how you as school boards will need to integrate and really think of the vision of how these work together in the school transformation. Next slide, please. So before we dive into a little bit more around UTK and UPK, we really want to stress who are our preschoolers right now. So California has about 1 million children that are preschool age, 3 million children under the age of 5. And we currently provide inadequate access to early education. So looking at those 3 and 4-year-olds very specifically, only 38% of all 4-year-old children are either enrolled in transitional kindergarten or the California State Preschool Program, and you'll see it called as CSPP on our slides. So even though 69% of our CSPPs are operated through an LEA, we still don't have enough coverage to include enough of our children. So looking at our 3-year-olds particularly, 81% of our entire 3-year-old population is not enrolled in any state subsidized early learning and care program. That doesn't mean that their family might not be paying for private pre-K, but it does mean we have a long way to go. And as we look at those 4-year-olds, there are a significant number of 4-year-olds who aren't enrolled and accessing as well. So this truly is a historic moment for us to lean in and say, we have something with Universal Transitional Kindergarten happening to create and address this space. So moving into, so what is UPK? The next slide. Universal Pre-Kindergarten in California, and we always say California always has to do it our way, so it's a different flavor from what other states might be doing. It starts, UPK is really Universal Pre-Kindergarten, which by 2025-26 will exist for all 4-year-old children in California. A lot of people think that Universal Transitional Kindergarten, or UTK, and UPK are the same thing. So I really want to clarify for all of you how we at CDE have been trying to message that and how local educational agencies or LEAs are being asked to think of it as they work on their UPK planning and implementation plans. So if you look at the graphic there, UTK is part of UPK, but it's not the only part. So it does include a broader mixed delivery system. A huge part of that is also going to be our California State Preschool Program, or CSPP, which the CDE operates, along with other pre-kindergarten programs serving 3 and 4-year-old children, which includes the federal Head Start program, but also community-based organizations, including family childcare and private preschool. And then our definition of UPK includes our expanded learning opportunities program, because that creates a TK to 6th grade full day program. That gets us up to 9 hours of programming and care that aligns more to the needs of California families now. Statute is very clear that families with 4-year-old children will have a choice, so they can enroll their child in TK, but they also can enroll them in those other programs if they're eligible and if they so choose. But stressing that TK is the only one that will be funded to universally provide access without having to determine eligibility and without the family having to pay. The other part that's really critical here is that LEAs must plan for that broader UPK. So while they are mandated to really move out and have TK happen as part of a broader kindergarten programming, they also have to plan for that bigger umbrella. So next slide. How do TK and UPK work together? And then what is that bigger P3 alignment frame? How does that fit with all of that? As we think about UPK implementation, we also want our districts to be thinking about this through a preschool to 3rd grade lens. And that's that overarching work that CDE is doing. A lot of school districts are also leaning into this and have been leading it to really address how we support our schools to connect the work they are doing across UPK, kindergarten, first, second, and third grade. And that's so there's a seamless continuum for students during their early years in the educational system. And it also helps us focus on aligning developmentally informed best practices from preschool up. So rather than coming down, really pushing up with developmentally informed practices. This may look like aligning curriculum across these early stages and grades. It might be professional development with preschool and kindergarten teachers. And it definitely has that transition that needs to be supported as children transition from preschool into elementary school. Next slide. So all of this UPK work really lies within this broader pre-K to third grade vision that all children have a strong and early start to education through high quality, joyful, rigorous, developmentally informed, inclusive, and coherent P3 learning opportunities, beginning with equitable access to UPK that really help ensure they thrive in school and in life, as well as being college and career ready. So all of this is rooted in the fact that we know early education and pre-K matter. There's undeniable evidence on the profound benefits of high quality pre-K experiences on children's brain development and key school readiness skills, and who we need to make sure has broader access to that, including our racially and historically marginalized children, low income, multilingual, and children with disabilities. So that opportunity gap that I mentioned in the beginning really already exists when they enter kindergarten, and here's our opportunity to address it earlier. We also know that sustaining the pre-K boost that happens it relies on effective transitions and alignment. So that goes back to that P3 place, where a lot of the research on effective pre-K is now saying if you're not then making sure the quality of the programming after preschool is there and that alignment is there, then we're not addressing the boost and being able to really accelerate what they've learned in their pre-K program. So that is my beginning. And I think from here, I get to hand it over to Dr. Bruce Fuller and Abigail Slavik from the University of California at Berkeley.
Thanks, Sarah. So picking up on the major themes that Sarah's laid out, at Berkeley, we've been working with CSBA to think through what are the major questions that local school board members should be asking. The action is clearly moving from Sacramento now down to the state's 1,000 school boards. And we wanted to preview a policy brief that CSBA will be putting out this week that helps to inform you locally as to what kinds of questions you should be asking and pursuing as you plan for UTK. So in our brief time presenting, Abby and I are going to cover these three areas. We're going to sketch the contours of the state's aspirations for Universal TK, following up on Sarah's presentation. Sketch 4 key questions local board members may ask as they plan and come up with their architecture and blueprint by the end of June. And secondly, talk a little bit about variation in local conditions and how your district is unique in terms of the demographic and geographic situation, putting your district in the context of statewide activities. Next slide, please. So as Sarah has previewed here, starting next year in August, this coming August, birth dates will shift forward 2 months to allow more 4-year-olds access to TK, working towards universal access over the next 3 or 4 years. Between now and 25-26, the state estimates that will pull in about 250,000 additional 4-year-olds into the public school system, assuming a 70-75% enrollment rate. In addition, the state has made a huge step in terms of enriching staffing ratios within TK classrooms. This ratio goes to 12-1 starting in August for all TK classrooms, and will hopefully go down to 10-1, fiscal conditions permitting. Now, as you know, locally, we're already facing a shortage of new teachers in the labor force. TK is going to add to that stress a bit. Over the next 3 or 4 years, we'll need at least another 11 or 12,000 new teachers to staff TK classrooms, and probably upwards of about 25,000 classroom aides. So this is going to be a huge lift for local districts. It's a pretty ambitious timeline, and these sorts of conditions will start to be felt in your districts quite soon, if not already. Next slide. So here at Berkeley, and working with staff at CSBA, we've really delineated 4 key questions we think you all may want to be asking on your local boards with your superintendents and with top district staff. And I'm going to go through each of these questions briefly. Again, the details are in a policy brief that CSBA is posting later this week. Next slide. The first question is, how do we coordinate our planning activities? Sarah's shop is kindly asking for pretty detailed TK expansion plans by the end of June. You've already heard your staff talking about planning activities. This is going to require some real coordinated activity across elementary and early education units within district offices. We also know that county offices, oftentimes county offices of education, often have staff with specialists in the early childhood education area. They've been given state funds to help backstop and provide advice to local districts. The other thing to keep in mind is that many TK programs just run for half days. They might let out at 12:30, 1:30 in the afternoon. That's going to be a challenge as you try to serve working parents in the district. The other planning task, which is receiving a lot of attention from districts that we've been talking with, is that classrooms in TK look quite a bit different, perhaps, than a 3rd or 4th grade classroom. This is not a task around didactically delivering curriculum material or getting ready for standardized testing. This is all about creating joyful and learning environments that foster kids' natural curiosity, providing developmentally appropriate practices for 4-year-olds. So this is really a new and novel way of thinking about classroom activities for people that are more steeped in conventional elementary education approaches. And as Sarah previewed, you already operate in a pretty complicated ecology of early care providers, the nonprofit pre-K providers that Sarah mentioned, licensed childcare homes, individual caregivers, many of which are now publicly subsidized. So you're not the only pre-K operator, you're not the only public agency that's looking after young kids, and working with those partners is going to be crucial in providing full day, full year, high quality pre-K for youngsters. Next slide. The second question is, if you're already operating early childhood programs, and many districts are, that could be a state preschool program, CSBP. Districts and county offices oftentimes are prime contractors for federal Head Start pre-K. Some districts are using local control funding to already support TK and kindergarten classrooms. So the question is how can you consolidate and streamline those activities? State and federal agencies have kind of put together a patchwork, really going back to the 1960s. That's resulted in a lot of categorical aid funding. And that tends to create barriers and boxes inside school district offices. So part of the challenge here is to deal with this in an integrated fashion, as Sarah emphasized, and that requires rethinking your staff arrangements inside district offices. Do you have an early childhood manager in the district office already? Can the county office lend a hand if you don't? We know that in small districts, about 1/3 of the state's districts, you all are enrolling less than 12 TK kids. So this is going to be a new enterprise for many, many districts, and you really need to take stock of existing staffing arrangements. And Stephanie Saminsky will probably be addressing this from San Diego in a few minutes. Abby, I will hand it over to you for the next slide.
Thanks, Bruce. Yeah, so thinking of a third question for board members, here we have, how do you find qualified teachers and classroom aides? And some kind of sub-questions or points to consider here is one option for your district might be moving teachers from higher grade levels down to those TK classrooms. But in doing so, we need to make sure that these teachers are using developmentally appropriate practices for 4-year-olds. Another point to consider here is that the state has pushed back the requirement for 24 early childhood units to the 2023-24 school year. However, some districts are still mandating this requirement. Third here is that there are monies available for creating or expanding credentialing programs between universities and districts and or county offices. So thinking about how you might leverage those monies. And then finally, there are pre-K learning foundations available. And these, again, focus on those cognitive skills and what is socially and emotionally development for 4-year-olds. And then moving to a fourth question for board members. Here we ask, do we have sufficient classroom infrastructure to expand TK enrollments? And again, some sub-questions to think about here is that these facilities need to be different because these children are perhaps smaller. And so do you have those spaces? And then thinking about these spaces, potentially your school has available classrooms, or potentially your schools need to build new facilities. So thinking about which camp you maybe fit into, or maybe even another camp in itself. A third thing, again, Bruce has touched on this, is does your district already have partnerships with local nonprofit pre-Ks? If so, are those providing full day programming? And how will these partnerships be used going forward? And then funding wise, how is your district going to build these facilities? Do you maybe want to work on state facilities dollars? Do you want to try and pass local revenue bonds? So that is just something to consider within your board of how might we fund these new facilities. And so next, Bruce and I are going to transition, and we are going to kind of step away from those questions and provide just a little context of what is happening in the state so far. And so this will be state level, but we want to encourage you all to think locally about how your context is going to impact your TK implementation. And so some major takeaways here from these figures is that we found TK enrollments grew at highly varying rates over the last decade, especially when looking at our large versus smaller districts across the state. We also found that after an initial bump in TK enrollment levels, they've leveled off rather quickly. And then finally, the state is serving a large portion of Latinx children in TK programs, whereas other racial and ethnic groups maybe aren't opting for TK, or even those enrollment numbers have started to decline. So looking first at TK enrollment counts across California in 2019-20. Next slide. Here we have a map that shows all of the districts across the state. And one way to think of this figure is these red dots that you see could be thought of as hotspots. So these are our districts that are enrolling less than 4 TK students in 2019-20. That's the most recent year of data that we have from the state, just prior to the pandemic. And some kind of large statewide regional trends that we see is that large portions of the Bay Area, some far northern counties, Fresno County, and much of the Central Valley have lower enrollment numbers. So you see that those have more of these red hotspots, whereas LA, Orange County, San Diego County, and even parts of the East Bay have higher enrollment numbers. These districts are looking at more than 90 students enrolled in their TK programs. So just thinking regionally, what is happening if you're thinking about partnerships and what we could be doing to expand TK. And then our second figure here looks at the median or the middle number of TK enrollment counts in districts. And so what we did here, breaking it down, is we took the roughly 1,000 districts across the state and we broke them into quartiles. So that means there's 4 groups. Each group has roughly 250 districts. The first quartile, this blue line that you see at the bottom, are our smallest kindergarten enrollment numbers. Whereas the largest quartile, the largest 250 districts, are this yellow line, and those have the largest kindergarten enrollment numbers. And then what we presented here is not the mean, but the median, so the middle district within these quartiles. Along the x-axis, you'll see that we have years beginning in 2013-14, and we continue until 2019-20. This is the available data that we have from the state. And then along the y-axis, or the vertical axis, we have the median TK enrollment numbers. And so some takeaways from this figure, we can see that our larger districts have larger TK enrollments, whereas our smallest quarter of districts, this blue line, have roughly 0 to 1 students over these 7 years that we have available data. And likewise, you can see this kind of initial jump that I mentioned, and then we see a leveling off across kind of the district groups. So in addition to looking at districts in quartiles, we also looked at the state's trends for different racial and ethnic groups. So here we see we have the same x-axis from 2013-14 through 2019-20. Along the y-axis here, we have raw TK enrollment numbers. And then each different line here is a racial or ethnic group that we've decided to represent. So again, we see that we have a large portion of TK students that are Latinx. This maybe is expected given that roughly 55% of students across the state are Latinx, but we actually have an even larger percentage of TK students. And then some other considerations from this figure is that enrollment numbers have started decreasing for all groups, but Black families that enrolled their children in TK started decreasing in the 2015-16 school year, which is earlier than some of these other racial and ethnic groups. But again, all of this, we just want to remind you that your local context is really important to consider when you're thinking about how you are going to expand TK. And so moving forward, just kind of summary of what Bruce and I have talked about here is thinking about how your district is going to plan for TK coming off of the pandemic, giving fiscal fluidity, as well as a potential teacher shortage, thinking about how you might integrate programs that currently exist into your TK program within your district. Are there partnership opportunities available? Thinking about sufficient teachers with the right experience, especially thinking about development and what's developmentally appropriate. And then finally, thinking about sufficient classroom space and facility dollars. And just a reminder that we think is important is that, how can you leverage partnerships with your county office of education, potentially neighboring districts? And so if you have some more questions about that, we just encourage you to see the CSBA brief and all of their suite of resources that they're going to be providing. And with that, we will pass it over to Stephanie and Sandra, who are actually going to look more at the local level and what's happening in their districts.
Thank you, Abby. Thank you, Bruce and Sarah. That's all really great information. So for our next presenters, we have Dr. Stephanie Saminsky and Sandra Lee. They are both leaders in their district's TK programs, and their insights and experiences are just so impressive and useful that we wanted to do this more as a discussion with some guiding questions for their portion to get at some of the lessons learned, some of the challenges, and some of the successes that their programs have had. So Stephanie and Sandra, would you mind just briefly tell us about your LEAs and your transitional kindergarten programs?
Yeah, so I'll go first. Hi, I'm Sandra, and we are located in Merced, California, right in the middle. And we are a very small rural community. We have 2 elementary schools and 1 junior high. And so in our district, we have TK, 3 TK sessions between both elementary schools, and we have 5 preschool sessions. And they've operated separately most of these years, but in the past year or 2, we've been collaborating quite a bit more. And so currently what we do is we have for our TK classrooms, we have a lead teacher and then an aide. But I think Maya Angelou said, when you know better, you do better. And so what we do know is that we've been running highly successful preschool programs also. And those ratios are 1:8. And so moving forward for this next coming year, we have plans to staff our TK classrooms with an AM and a PM teacher, and they'll help support each other's sessions. And they'll also have a staff member, an instructional aide in there as well. So there will always be 3 adults in the classroom with the children. And that's a very common practice with California state preschools. As Sarah was saying, some sites have them, some don't, but that's what we have at our site. And so we're just going to continue with that. And then right now we're currently running a half-day program at 3.5 hours because we don't have enough facilities on site to house all of our TK students. But if we get grants and when all of that happens, our plan is to roll out into full-day programs with ELOP.
Thank you. I'm Stephanie Szymanski, the Director of Early Learning Programs for the San Diego Unified School District in Southern California. And San Diego Unified has approximately 98,000 to 100,000 students. And we began planning for what is called UTK back in 2019, 2020. And during this planning year, we were planning for a class that included all 4-year-olds, and what we called it was TK4. And we phased in TK4, which is now called UTK, in 2021 with 54 classrooms. Moving into 21-22, we expanded to 70 classrooms. And in 22-23, we are projected to have 132 classrooms across 118 school sites. We offer a full day setting with 24 maximum capacity of students and a 1:12 ratio. So we have a TK teacher and an ECE teacher teaching this developmentally appropriate classroom. We've also utilized the planning grant, Title I, Title II funds, and planning to use ESSER funds and teacher development grants. And one of the most important focuses for our program in our district is through the dynamic integration of our program departments. So ensuring that our actions, not only with early learning, but human resources, labor relations, neighborhood schools and enrollment options, all the actions that we put into place and strategies are aligned to the district's LCAP. So we ensure that equity and access is throughout our program, that our actions leverage expertise in the co-teaching model, that our curriculum is integrated through the developmental domains. We partner with families and explore their child's learning together. And it's a #1 priority to cultivate our leadership through career pipelines and professional development, not only for our paraeducators, but also our teachers and our leadership. And that way we have a whole dynamic program embedded throughout the entire district.
Wonderful. Bruce touched on this a little bit earlier in his slide, and you both actually touched on it a bit as well. But thinking even more about issues of curriculum and staffing right now when we're facing teacher shortages and perhaps having to look at existing staff within districts that either need to expand their TK programs or this is the first time that they're doing it. What approaches would you recommend taking, or what approaches has your district taken?
So in Merced, there's, it's complicated with TK, right? Because you have to have a credential and you have to have the 24 ECE units. And in our district, what we're finding is that our preschool teachers have the requirements and the permit to be a preschool teacher, but they don't have a credential, or vice versa. We might have a teacher that's in a higher grade that might want to go down to TK, but they don't have the 24 ECE units. So as a district, and a county, we're having to brainstorm, what can we do to help with this along the way? So we've paired up with our local county office of ed, and they have pre-service courses that are open right now. The teachers would take the 5 pre-service courses over the 5 months, and then they would be eligible to be in an intern program to get their credential once they do get hired. And one of the things that we've done to help with our staff is that we've offered to pay for those courses through the district also. And same for the teachers that are in upper grades that want to get those 24 ECE units. it's finding those grants that are available for them, finding, through like CDTC where they can apply for a permit and it would be covered. And so just finding the resources for them, because even in my district, I have a lot of even instructional aides that have BAs that want to move up into higher grades, but it would be unrealistic for me to ask a teacher who's making $15 an hour to shell out $1,000 in a short amount of time. So just being supportive of them in all ways possible. And then, through lots of one-on-one coaching, trainings, things like that.
One of the things that San Diego Unified has implemented or thought about in this new classroom environment, and we talk about it all the time, is that it really embraces the perfect blend. So it's the perfect blend between the California Preschool Learning Foundations and the state standards, where Sarah mentioned that children participate in learning that's joyful, it's active, it's challenging and process-oriented, where these young 4-year-olds are getting used to routines and schedules. And so when they are kindergarten ready, or when they enter that door in kindergarten, that they're ready to, it's a trajectory towards learning, and they already hit the ground running. Another thing that we always talk about is that UTK it's not preschool and but not yet kindergarten. And so this uniqueness creates the conditions that bridge learning while promoting confidence and creativity. And we offer professional development on conditions in the classroom. Because what is interesting is that many educators or parents or leadership, they talk about what does the classroom look like? Do they have a kitchen area? Do they have desks? Do they have tables? And it's quite interesting. And so we've made sure to include the full scope of professional development into the curriculum. In terms of staffing, one of the first things we did was that we utilized our existing TK teacher. So every one of our 118 elementary sites had a current TK teacher. And so in looking at our preschool program, our CSPP preschool program, we analyzed the enrollment trends, and we found out how many 3-year-olds we have or how many 4-year-olds we have. And could we convert some of these preschool classrooms into UTK classrooms? So based on our enrollment trends and our projections, we designed the 54 expanding into 70 and expanding into the 132 classrooms for next year. We were able to use our existing TK teachers to support the UTK classroom. And then we were able to utilize our existing ECE teachers to be paired with the TK credentialed teacher for the co-teaching model. And what this has done is it's leveraged the expertise and it's maximized our resources, where the ECE teacher has that early childhood experience, transitioning into TK, and many TK teachers have taught K. And so that developmental continuum that we're building in that classroom has really supported the advancement of this classroom. Also, with our expansion, we have created a workforce pipeline to support our educators in obtaining the ECE credential, multiple subject credentials, TK authorizations, or a degree. We've partnered with the University of Laverne. They have designed special cohorts for San Diego Unified, where teachers can conduct their student teaching while they have a full-time job. So we eliminate those barriers that they would have to take a leave of absence, and they can still continue to work full-time. We also have a partnership with San Diego State University that supports this growth as well.
Great. And when looking at the last two questions here, they kind of blend together, so we can kind of put them together. But one of the things that we're hearing from people and that we've seen is that it may be challenging for families approaching these mixed delivery systems to understand all of their options. And so I was wondering if you could speak on any strategies that you've used for that, or just generally any last lessons that you want LEAs implementing TK for the first time to understand in this.
So this is something that our district is definitely still working on. It's still in process, but we do plan to survey our families just through local parent action committee meetings, just asking parents what the needs might be. Because right now TK and our CSPP sites are looking very similar, but a little different, right? And so as we start to ask and question, survey families about what the needs are, and then how we can adjust that to better meet their needs for TK. But, you know, after speaking with Stephanie the other day, it really got us thinking about how are we aligning our own departments within our early education departments, because pre-K is here, TK is here. So really a blended model. When they say it takes a village to raise a child, no kidding, it takes a village to build TK. So we have to, and this kind of goes back to that second question too, of curriculum. It's not just curriculum for the children, but curriculum for staff too, understanding what's developmentally appropriate across the board. Lots of acronyms in early ed that I'm realizing that elementary levels don't really understand yet because they haven't had to do it. So like things like understanding environmental scales like ECHRs, very common in early ed, but not so much in the elementary world, or things like looking at interactions between teachers and students with class, looking at DRDPs, using that for observations. All of this is new. And so blending the departments together is going to be a process for us. And as we're doing that, you know, seeing what we're really, I guess we have a blank canvas right now and we're painting it as we go.
Some of the things that we would share with other districts, and like Sandra said, we were already full of ideas just talking to each other the other day. And so one of the things that has helped our district is focusing on 3 major areas. So kind of making categories of operational actions, instructional actions, and communication, and developing a common vocabulary and shared vision. And so throughout our district, when I talk about integration, we all district-wide have the same vocabulary, the same knowledge, the same understanding of what UTK is. So when an area superintendent is talking to a family at an area cluster meeting, they're using the same language that would come from early learning, or human resources is using the same language when they're holding a recruitment event, that we all have a true understanding of what that classroom looks like and what our goal is and expected outcomes for our students. Another thing that has been a success for us is that we've had a high volume of interest. So we this year had schools that would fill to capacity in about 12 hours. And so that's a challenge that comes with it, because you're moving at the speed of light. And you know, everyone wants to go to their neighborhood school, everyone wants in, and you are trying to find a space for all your families. Another thing that has been successful is talking about the curriculum, but truly building that alignment of the developmental continuum. We not only to professional learning, but we've developed different PLC cohorts designed on different content areas, like on interactive writing, phonemic awareness. And we also build a collaborative peer network for our principals. So our principals have really taken ownership and been very highly accountable for our program. And this allows them to leverage their knowledge and have a peer to talk to, just like Sandra and I talking as directors, or superintendents talking, or Board of Education. It's really helpful to have that peer to engage with and just brainstorm and have a thought partner. And one of the most aha moments that I'll share is when talking to educators or principals or teachers or families to help them understand what options they have, is we make sure to highlight the continuum that's built at our school. So we may have Head Start partnership, where it has the infant toddlers, and then we have our part day preschool for the 3-year-olds on the same campus. And then we also have our UTK feeding into K. And it was really important for us to have this continuum where students and families get to know their neighborhood school, where they have the opportunity to begin their educational career and move throughout the system. It's something that we're really proud of and has worked really well for our families.
Wonderful. Great. Thank you both for sharing those lessons. There's so much great information in there. I'm sure we'll get to some more questions at the end of the webinar. So thank you both. Right now, we're going to transition back to Sarah Neville Morgan, who's going to tell us a little bit about CDE guidance and some resources for UPK planning and implementation.
Thanks so much, Jeremy. So this is probably the not as fun part of the webinar, but hopefully we'll lay out some of the things that we're actually all required to do. So thinking of all that framing that just happened, the considerations and questions that both Bruce and Abby laid out, and then what Stephanie and Sandra were able to share from their school districts, there are some requirements that really pull together a lot of what they just shared. One of the main ones is that LEAs must develop a plan to articulate how they will implement UPK in their communities. And it is very specific that it is UPK, not just TK, for the planning purposes. So that plan, if I'll read from our education code, must be for consideration by the governing board or body at a public meeting on or before June 30th, 2022, for how all children in the attendance area of the local educational agency will have access to full day learning programs the year before kindergarten that meet the needs of parents, including through partnerships with the Expanded Learning, the After School Education and Safety Program, or ACEs, the California State Preschool Program, which was CSPP, Head Start programs, and other community-based early learning and care programs. Next slide, please. So the purpose of this UPK planning template is really to offer the planning questions for LEA consideration. Oh, I should back up. So based on the fact that there was ed code that requires a plan, the CDE pulled together a UPK design team and some work groups to really come up with what would a template for planning purposes be. And then from that, we put it out to really help LEAs understand what they would need to consider in developing those comprehensive plans for UPK that meet community and family needs. And what it does is it outlines not just recommended questions of here's things you should consider, but it also has some required elements of data that will be required to be submitted to CDE in order to meet the requirements of education code. So there's both recommended. None of the plan is required for us, like that template is not required to be used. It is an optional template, but there are required data elements that are laid out in it. Another key part really of the template and the process is for the school boards to be able to weigh in on ensuring there's vision and coherence around what's being put together for their school district. So looking at providing equity of access for all students and families, looking at those partnerships with the broader early learning and care system, developing a coherent educational plan that now begins with UPK and includes that access to TK as well as other options, and looking at a full day experience through the Expanded Learning Opportunities Program. If your district received those funds, most districts did, but also allowing for you to use state preschool or other funds to create that full day plus experience. So in planning for UPK, we would really say, I think echoing some of what Sandra and Stephanie said, to look at how your administrative structure will support the school leadership in connecting across these parts of our system that have been typically siloed. So we hear a lot that state preschool or some of the early learning care sits in one part of both the school district and a county office, and then TK curriculum and instruction sits somewhere else, and making sure that those now are connected, either integrating or connecting, but some really strong, clear way that they are pulled together. And all of that will help as you're not just planning, but implementing these pieces and thinking about what you're providing during the instructional parts of the day, the before and after school, the intersession, and those summer learning and care components, and stressing that you have this plan, and we've definitely heard the pandemic and know that there are a lot of plans out there. So our part would be, how do you connect those plans? So looking at your Expanded Learning Opportunities Program and how is that plan connecting with this? And I think, Stephanie, you were the one who said, like, thinking of our LCAP and how does this sit within that as well. Next slide, please. To assist LEAs in creating their plans, we've released a planning template and guidance and some documents. So what you'll see on here really are some of those documents that are resources that are both on the CDE elementary page as well as on California Educators Together, where we're trying to really have a platform of professional learning and resources available. So that first is that planning template, and it includes the planning questions that I outlined, as well as recommended versus sort of required elements. And then the guidance document, we've released a phase 1 of guidance, and we're almost ready to release the phase 2, which goes into a lot of the best practices. It introduces the early education concepts, some of those terms, some of the research, the resources, partnership opportunities, and really drops into explaining those a little bit more. And then our third one is guidance that's really directed at the County Office of Education, who also is receiving some of the UPK planning and implementation grants to pull together all of the LEAs within their county and do some broader countywide capacity building. So all of those pieces are there. And I'll preview a little bit around UPK curricula in just a second. So next slide. Obviously, there is a lot to think about for planning UPK. It's a little bit easier in that everybody had started with TK and those requirements, but one of the things we really want to stress is that the traditional start of TK was really capturing those children who would have previously been in kindergarten in California. This new expansion eventually will include all children who are 4 by September 1st. That moves us from that closer part of kindergarten really to a pre-K preschool experience. And with that needs to come some additional thoughts around what were we using for curriculum that no longer would be completely applicable to a younger 4-year-old. How have we set up our classroom? Going to some of the things that were expressed by Stephanie and Sandra around how do we make it look? What is the feel? What are similarities with state preschool now in TK? All of those pieces, and how does P3 fit with that? So moving to the next slide, one of the biggest issues that we will raise up is the work we all have to do on curricula. So CDE obviously cannot endorse or recommend a specific curricula, but we do have some best practices that we outline. And we do have our preschool learning foundations, which are the standards for preschool age children. And those are aligned into the Common Core. So looking at all of that, we would really recommend that all of you think through the curricular experience that needs to happen in your TK and then in the broader UPK. So acknowledging that whole child curricula has their strengths and weaknesses. A whole child approach is really driven by that child-centered learning that encourages the independent play and exploration. It has domains such as social, emotional, language, science, literacy, and math. So in theory, that whole child approach really comes from that developmentally based, developmentally appropriate. But in practice, research has demonstrated that this approach alone falls short in really meaningfully building upon children's key school readiness skills. So looking at some of the curriculum that's available that's whole child or comprehensive, and really taking that critical lens of, is this providing teachers with explicit guidance on how to intentionally build upon skills, especially in math and literacy? So if the curricula that's whole child doesn't provide math activities that span the sequence of introducing different math topics and doesn't provide the guidance on how to individualize those activities for children of different developmental levels, you'll really need to look at a skills-specific curricula that can help support that and fortify how the teacher is bringing that into the classroom with the children. So just a little bit there that we want everyone to be very mindful of, also knowing that there's a mix of teacher and child-led experiences, both from center or group time to small group, and making sure we have more and more of the children's time in their centers independently, getting support maybe more one-on-one or with those small groups, and less of their time in a whole group activity. So embedding assessments and opportunities for individualization based on where the children are using child development assessments, those observational assessments to understand, and then pulling those out using the curricular themes that are really culturally relevant. Culture and language are so critical to all children, obviously, but really deeply for our earliest learners. And so supporting children's home language and acquisition of English, or I always want this, like if you're going to have a dual language immersion program, the earlier you start, the better it is. Children's brains can handle more than one language. So starting these in your state preschool, then your TK, then your K, really creates that ability to have a multilingual program that's very robust and meaningfully addresses a lot of the brain science. So that piece there. And then how are you ensuring your programs are inclusive? So one of the areas that I didn't show was, some of the data on our least restrictive environment from our IDEA and children with disabilities, but California does not do very well on our LRE. So this is another opportunity for school districts to really look at where their children with disabilities are, look at each child's individualized education plan, and make sure you have more opportunities for children to be in inclusive settings. And UPK really creates that opportunity for all of you. So next slide. I think we would all say everything's really critical, but it's always all about those adults. So whether it be those of you on the school board to the superintendent and the principals and that leadership level, and then down into the classrooms with those teachers. So we're aware that to have alignment with curricula and learning standards, that the workforce also has to be aligned. So thinking of that staffing for TK and ensuring that we're getting teachers that can really truly understand and support the developmental needs of 4-year-olds, right? These are not 5-year-olds, they're not 8-year-olds, but 4-year-olds. The staffing requirements are outlined in education code in that it is a teacher with a credential, and that they also have to have these 24 units of early childhood education. So in all of that, there is a lot of work that we've been doing through a UPK state leadership team that includes our Commission on Teacher Credentialing. We have heard you. We know for years we've had a stressed teacher pipeline, and that the COVID and all these other things have really exacerbated that. And now we have this significant expansion for TK where we're going to need more teachers. So really, I'm always hoping we'll see some changes happening, but CTC is working on transforming one of their specialist credentials to become a P3 early childhood specialist credential. And that group, they're actually meeting tomorrow with their commission to present it. I would say it's really critical when we look at wanting to have teachers that have that 24 units and create a pathway either up from a child development permit and a bachelor's and what they would need for this, or if you already have a multiple subjects credential, what you would need to add a specialist, which wouldn't be a full credential for them, just this little piece. But a lot there around we look at the teacher and how to best create a pipeline in a workforce. There's a lot of resources that were in the budget, the Golden State Teacher Grants, the residency grants, which are really critical about having that grow your own type of programs. And right now, what's out is the Early Education Teacher Development Grant, $100 million for LEAs to address their state preschool and TK workforce, and then professional learning that also goes up into kindergarten to address some of that alignment. So I think I'm almost done. I have one more slide. As we look at those P3 alignment updates and we talk about curriculum and we talk about the teachers and what they need to know and be able to do for 4-year-olds, we actually got some funds in the current budget to address our preschool learning foundations, which are the standards for preschool programming in California. And those revisions are going to include updates around math, language literacy, science, social emotional, English language development, social sciences, visual and performing arts, physical development, and health. We'll be incorporating more culturally inclusive examples across the milestones within each domain to more fully address racial and cultural bias. We're going to be adding an approaches to learning domain to really highlight executive functioning and self-regulation skills. and will be more explicitly calling out the development of dual language learners and children with disabilities across each domain. The other big part of that is that it will be expanded to be able to show that P3 and that touch up to how does this framework then go into the Common Core standards, and how would this align up into that, so that our educators can really understand the developmental progression of skills. So that is the CDE portion of this. And Jeremy, I think I hand it back to you and Chris.
Thanks, Sarah. Appreciate it. So my bit's a little bit shorter. Wanted to kind of recognize a lot of the work that's been done, and but also kind of acknowledge that there's quite a bit more work and need for districts in terms of how they're going to be and the challenges that they face in implementing TK. CSBA, along with many of our partners in the advocacy world, have been working hard with the legislature and on the budget level to really raise a number of issues. And so here on this next slide, you'll see kind of one of our main issues that in relation to facilities that remain. But before I jumped into it, I do want to provide a quick kind of overview of just sort of some of the continued commitment that we've seen in the budget in relation to implementing Universal Transitional Kindergarten. And you know, where that is on Prop 98. So in Prop 98, last year when we heard the governor announce his plans to do the 5-year expansion of Universal Transitional Kindergarten, he had stated the intent of the budget to what we call rebench or increase the base funding guarantee for Prop 98 to reflect the growth in number of children who would enroll under this program. And this year, we were really pleased to see that the governor has proposed roughly about $640 million to increase the Prop 98 guarantee. And we're hopeful that we'll see those rebenchings occur each year as the number of children grow with the year-over-year expansion of TK. And many of you also are aware, last year there was the intent of the governor to reduce the adult to student ratio for TK. And this year we saw a proposal in the governor's budget of about $383 million in ongoing Proposition 98 general funds to lower the teacher, or the, I should say, the adult to student child ratio from 12-to-1 to 10-to-1 beginning in this coming school year. But in regards to the challenges that remain, one of the biggest challenges that many of you all I'm sure are experiencing is, how are we going to house these children? Facility capacity will continue to be a significant barrier. This is an area where CSBA and others are going to continue to advocate for additional funding for TK facilities. In the current year budget, we did see the provision of $490 million through a grant program that will go through the state allocation board. But it basically is spread over a number of different programs and uses. You'll see your state preschool, transitional kindergarten, and kindergarten facilities. That is, a significant amount of funds, but when we're talking about nearly 1,000 districts in California, and many of them, right, are at different phases of implementation of TK, it is just not going to go far enough. So we are continuing to advocate for that. On this next slide, you'll see that there are some challenges to even those dollars, because many districts who actually have locally approved bonds may not have the adequate language in that bond structure to fund TK or kindergarten programs, depending on how they structured those bonds and how those bonds were approved by local voters. This, it sometimes places districts at a disadvantage because there are match requirements. And so how districts are able to use their own local bonds for that particular match is important. And of course, TK facilities, this was mentioned earlier on in the presentation, also face some unique challenges in that they have to comply with Title V program requirements. And you'll see this if you look at the state allocation board's recent announcement back in January of the availability of that $490 million, that they do have to meet these Title V program requirements, right? We're talking, obviously smaller chairs, greater access to bathrooms, different location on school sites, separate play areas, line to site, parameters inside the classroom, and so forth. So facilities remains one of the main challenges that on the kind of the advocacy side and in the discussions around the budget that remain to be a top priority for CSBA. Next slide. There are some additional challenges that have been mentioned here, least of which obviously is where we're going to find all of these teachers. At a August 2021 meeting of the California Commission on Teacher Credentialing, they heard testimony that that the state will need upwards of 11,000 teachers to staff all TK classrooms at full implementation by the 25-26 school year. There are a number of different ways that these conversations are happening. There is a discussion, currently right now that, and the CTC will be actually meeting this week to provide an overview of discussions around the creation of a P3 multi-subject credential, as well as other pathways to help increase greater access to teacher preparation programs. And there's also continued discussion around the multi-delivery system approach. And Sarah mentioned this a lot in terms of the local community-based partnerships and work that districts can do. And those discussions continue in terms of the roles and potential expanded roles that local community-based organizations, other community programs can help provide and serve children who are in need, even beyond TK. And of course, school transportation funding, we have not seen as much of an investment in school transportation funding in the past 2 decades at least. One of the main priorities of CSBA this year is to provide full 100% of cost for school districts as well as a COLA. These are lofty goals, but these are real challenges that districts face. Many, especially for our rural and more smaller school districts, right, where bus transportation is heavily relied upon to be able to help get kids to school. And there's one more unique issue that affects some districts here on this next slide relating to community-based funded districts, or kind of what we refer to as or know as basic aid districts. These are districts, right, that have some higher property tax revenues, but don't necessarily mean that they are wealthier districts. They're just funded differently. There's about a 10%, maybe a little bit more than 10% of districts in California are basic aid. They don't currently receive additional funding for TK like others districts who are LCFF funded. And so they do face very unique challenges. CSBA is, along with some of our other partners, are continuing to push and advocate for additional funding, recognizing that many basic aids are kind of smattered and kind of alongside other districts that are LCFF funded and do present some challenges. So these are just kind of some overview of some of the larger issues that I'm sure many of your districts are facing, and that are continuing to be hot topics of discussion and areas of focus for advocacy within both the legislature and in the state budget conversation. And I'll turn it back over to Jeremy.
Thank you, Chris. That was great. I want to thank all of the panelists for their time and expertise today. We do have some questions in the chat, but before we get to the questions, I did want to take a moment to highlight that this webinar is a part of a larger suite of resources that CSBA has launched on their website. So included in these resources are the video from this webinar and slide deck, a governance brief written by Bruce Fuller and Abigail Slovic, who is on this call. In that brief, they go a little bit deeper into each of those questions that board members should consider. There are some quick facts and an infographic on UTK in California, some data on those current state of UTK in California. And we also include 2 examples of districts who have already enacted UTK, including San Diego Unified, Stephanie's district, who is here with us today. These resources are all available at the CSBA UTK landing page, which is linked within this slide and has also been put in the chat a few times by our director, Mary Briggs. All right, with that said, let's go to some of the questions. We'll field as many as we can today. If all the presenters wouldn't mind putting your cameras on for this portion so you can all jump in as you see fit. I will direct some of these questions directly to you, but if any other panelist has anything to add, feel free to unmute and add to those questions. So To start off, I think with Sarah, we have a question you might be able to help us field, but we offer full day TK across the district and will expand by birth date as mandated. We are a small district and don't have preschool programs. We aren't required to host a preschool program under UPK since our students will have access to our TK program. Is that correct?
This is where it gets really tricky. And Chris, you can sort of jump in and why I said California never does anything simply. So you're required to stand up TK and you'll be getting ADA for TK as that expands out. And for the planning and implementation, you're required to plan for this broader UPK and show how there's an availability of choice for families. But you're not funding those other parts. It's just sort of bringing them together in a plan. You can in that say, like, for our 3-year-olds, we've got state preschool and there's parental choice. So parents could still remain in state preschool at age 4. So it gets really tricky. What you have to offer is TK. And then your planning and the intent is for you to really pull together a broader system. Chris, what are the nuances that you would add for that?
No, I think that's right. In terms of preschool and the planning issues, there are some hitches there. I think more kind of directly answering the question, no, the school districts aren't required to offer preschool. In terms of TK, there is now the beginning requirement, and the way TK generally kind of works is if you have a parent who comes to enroll their child at your school district, you're required to offer TK. But that there is not a requirement to offer TK at that school site. So there are various ways in terms of capacity that districts can be able to address how they can meet the demand for TK. So it really comes down to a district's ability to identify where they have school site capacity to be able to open a classroom and enroll students. And sometimes, unfortunately right now, because of many districts maybe not having the capacity, not every elementary school site can offer TK. So that can place some of a challenge on parents having to transport a child to maybe not their neighborhood school, but to an adjacent neighborhood school that might have greater capacity.
Those were really important considerations there, Chris. So what we will ask you all to sort of lean in on as we look at transforming California schools is where is the family need most critical. So we think you're going to get a lot of pressure and interest, as Stephanie outlined, to have these everywhere because families want them in their neighborhood school. And you probably all know the data that if a family starts in a school, they're more likely to remain in that school. Not 100%, but there is definitely some connection with where you start and where you stay. And so really looking at those families who may have lack of access to transportation or other stress factors, that means it would be much easier if it was close by, we think are pretty critical. We're always hoping that additional facility supports come along because we know that is such a big pressure across how we implement UPK in a really good, high quality way. And sorry, Bruce, I saw you actually raised your hand because you went to kindergarten and obviously I needed to learn some lessons.
I'm practicing my indoor voice constantly. Just to put a sharp point on what Sarah just said, I mean, ideally parents can see the school as the center for pre-K activities, but that's going to require care after school. It may require full year care during the summer. That's why these partnerships are so essential, both for parents and in the interest of school districts, so that parents see the school as the beginning point for that early education.
Great. So the next topic has come up a couple of times in the question, so I'm going to combine a couple of these into one, but some of the confusion that we're hearing is around what does it mean to be full day TK? Does it mean the same instructional minutes as kindergarten, or is it moving towards a full day reflective of first grade and above? And then also just on top of that, will the state be providing funding for full day pre-K?
I will start, and once again, I'm going to call on my friend Chris to help me out there because it's all so nuanced in California. So the TK is still on the books as the first year of a 2-year kindergarten program. So even though when the governor talks about it, he talks about another grade, it officially still is part of K. So you'd be aligning it with that. At the same time, we know there's a lot behind families having, students having a fuller day than that 3 hours for even their curricular experiences, their times for all the center-based learning activities, their outdoor play, all of those pieces are kind of hard to get into just a couple hours. So really thinking through what's the best experience that we need to have, knowing that you have facility challenges. I will also say, as we look at your plans that you have, we have really said the first year might be a draft plan. As you start to roll it out, you are going to have to update that plan for the next couple of years, because implementation will give you some lessons learned, because you'll get access to facilities money and you'll be able to create some other things. So we know that things will sort of morph and change these first couple of years. The part that becomes more complicated is that if you have the early learning opportunities program funding, then you're required to offer 9 hours, at least 9 hours of programming to, depending on your unduplicated count of children, about 80% of your students must be able to access it and have it offered. So that's before school, that's after school, it addresses intersession and summer. You can use the ELOP funds for that, but you can also use your state preschool. If you have a Head Start, you can use your Head Start. It's just stacking those things together to create those 9 hours of what we're calling extended learning and care. If you don't have those funds and your school district isn't beholden to that part, then that full day experience tends to be broader than the school day. And really, you're supposed to look at what do our families need. And Bruce can really talk to this well. There is a lot of research that shows our families who most could benefit from high quality pre-K cannot take advantage and don't take advantage when it's only a few hours a day. So like Chicago public schools had to go through this whole awakening process where they looked at who was accessing, looked at their data, realized their students in their communities were not accessing it, and redid to create a full day program, which then started to get more and more of their, particularly their Black students, engaged in their public pre-K program. I don't know, Bruce, if you have more on that, but it's pretty important to offer more than a couple hours, unless you want just upper middle class families who may not have 2 working families to engage in it.
Well, I think that's right on point, Sarah. And we know from the evidence that if we can reach a threshold level of quality, a full day program is going to have more sustainable effects than only 2 or 3 hours of quality pre-K.
In terms of, what does a full day or a part day kindergarten day look like, and what does that mean for funding for a school district, i.e. your apportionment? I'll point you to essentially the education code, and I'll just nerd out here a little bit. It's education code 48,000 is the governing code here, and it defines TK as the first year of a 2-year kindergarten program, and also says that it's not a additional level of service, if you will. And so it is defined as kindergarten. And so nothing changes in that regard in relation to how you meet the minimum state requirements to be able to draw down your apportionment. From the perspective if to get at the issue of the apportionment kind of nature of the question is how I took that. And so that particular area is where what really guides how long the school day is. I will say that this is a topic of conversation also in the legislature. There is some interesting legislative proposals that are being considered to try to get districts to offer more full day. There was a study by the Legislative Analyst's Office a number of years ago. It wasn't fully representative of all districts in terms of the sample size, but generally speaking, what the LAO had reported was that about 60% of districts that currently offer kindergarten offer full day kindergarten, and the rest offer part day kindergarten. And of course, that comes back to our, one of the original issues that a lot of districts are facing, and that is capacity, facility capacity, right? Many school districts will offer a morning program and an afternoon program so that they can have one teacher, right, teach a morning class, and then they'll do a separate afternoon class because they don't have the additional classrooms to do full day. So these are just continuing topics of discussion also in the legislature, recognizing the priority that the state has placed on and expanding access to early care and education and kindergarten.
Okay. So our next question here, Sandra and Stephanie might be able to help a little bit with this one as well as Sarah. But can you please expand on partnering with other agencies? Do these agencies need to meet ELOP requirements in order to qualify for partnership? So maybe Sandra and Stephanie can take the first part there and then.
Yeah, so in our county, we are trying to think outside of the box a little bit. So we've really, we just recently had a meeting with Boys and Girls Club at our local level, and planning to use them for ELP for the summer programs, and just trying to provide our children with opportunities they wouldn't typically have. And we do have an after school care program, and we're working with our county office of ed on expanding that with our TKers too. Currently, the one site doesn't even take kinder quite yet, but I just can't throw a bunch of TKers to an after school program. I have to make sure they're ready and they are trained, and things need to be put in place. So we're starting to do that now. Like I said, there are programs that are running really good things. So I always like to go and observe as many places as I can and copy and paste. If things are already being ran well in other counties, I we'll try to implement it in our district also, or in our county. But we're just working with either outside alternative agencies, with our county office of ed, looking at all kinds of options with resource and referral, also looking at options of like a CCTR or a fetch-in program with family childcare providers. So there's just so many options out there. And it's just looking to see what's going to best fit our families.
I'll just add a couple of things. We have different layers of support embedded throughout our district. So we have an extended learning and care department that supports the before and after school. We also have Level Up San Diego, which offers the intersession and summer school or summer opportunities for accelerated learning, where all partners from throughout San Diego come together, and there's focused instructional STEAM in the morning, and then enrichment activities in the afternoon. So, resemble camp or tennis, different activities. But also we partner with the YMCA San Diego and also Head Start in regards to building that continuum of services, where we have the infant toddler feeding into preschool, feeding into the elementary school continuum that helps support that.
I'll just add on that. So, Chris, I'm living in 4,800 right now, as you can probably imagine, as we keep diving back in. But the other part around apportionment is for the ELOP. So the ELOP funds are also apportionment funds, which is why if you're receiving those, you're required to then do that up a minimum of 9 hours of programming. So you have the instructional time, and then you have time on top of and beyond that for exactly what Stephanie was just outlining, right? So the before school, the after school, the intersession, and the summer. And going to what Sandra said too, like the reason they did for that ELOP for TK and K, it's a 1-to-10 ratio. So it's not putting them in the same exact program with all the other kids who might be in your after school expanded learning program, but really making sure you have something that's more developmentally appropriate for TK and K. And so that might be you're partnering with Head Start, it might be the Boys and Girls Club, it might be that you take your ELOP and you have one of your classrooms dedicated to that while the other kids are in the multi-purpose. Whatever it might look like, just always keep in mind what's going to really benefit these younger students in my programming as I address the 9-hour requirements. And with that, the other flag is that unlike with ACEs, the child does not have to come every day and they don't have to stay the whole time. You just have to offer it. And that's really, really critical in a difference for that.
And I just wanted, just for folks who are wondering kind of when we say ELOP, we're talking about the Expanded Learning Opportunities Program. There's actually a grant program that was created at the beginning of the pandemic, and I just want to make sure that folks aren't confused with it. It's also called the Expanding Learning Opportunities grant program. So the difference is one has grant and one doesn't. So what we're talking about is the Expanding Learning Opportunities Program. So that's always helpful in terms of how you're interacting with your school business officials and your school staff to make sure that we're talking about the right program and the appropriate utilization of funds.
Wonderful. The next couple of questions here, I'm going to kind of combine together because they both touch on staffing and curricular issues. One is asking if the state has approved or recommended curricular programs for UTK, which I think you touched on in your presentation, Sarah. And also, are districts going to be able to utilize preschool credentialed teachers for UTK?
Yeah, the state is not able to recommend a specific curriculum. We are going to look at some additional curriculum pieces as part of our Preschool Learning Foundation's additional work and as part of our desired results developmental profile work. And in regards to the credentialed teacher, that also lives in 4800, which is why I feel like I live there right now. And the meeting at CTC tomorrow is to really address how to take the specialist credential and do a P3 credential with a couple different pathways. One of those would be if you have somebody right now, like in your state preschool, who has a child development permit and a bachelor's degree, how can that teacher then become qualified to be a credentialed teacher and teach your TK? So 4800 does create some restrictions for all of us in that, and we're working with the administration on that and raising up the pipeline issues. These have to be credentialed teachers. They really need to have child development and that strong understanding of pedagogy and curriculum going through those early grades.
And also, there is a grandfather clause, if you will, in the education code. So if you're a district where you've assigned a TK teacher prior, I don't remember the year, but they've been, and I'll have to go and double check, I apologize, but if they were assigned to the classroom, I think by 2012, that they can continue, and they don't have the requisite number of, say, ECE credits, or they don't have a credential, they can continue to serve in that classroom. And actually, if they've gone on to serve a different grade and then return to TK, they can still teach a TK. It's a very unique and sliver of folks who can qualify who don't have the credential, but it does provide some flexibility to districts in terms of how they can help staff a TK classroom.
Great.
And that's what I will always put on my other hat to say yes, and just make sure these are younger and younger 4-year-olds. It does start to take new and different knowledge of them. And so whatever you can do to partner up with institutes of higher ed, with your COE, and really make sure there are things brought to your teachers so that they have the support to best work in these classrooms and teach these younger students.
Our next question is something Bruce and Abby touched on in their presentation, but as the state looks at lowering adult student ratios, will there be additional funding to support lowering those ratios going forward?
Well, as Chris mentioned, Jeremy, the governor is adding money to keep lowering that ratio, ideally down to 10 kids to every one adult in the classroom. Again, we haven't talked too much about the supply of classroom aides. Sarah mentioned the new grant program to try to train more aides, but this is a crucial area of need, and hoping the community colleges and state universities will rally to produce more aides, because if we don't have the bodies, the ratio is going to be hypothetical. But we do know that if we have more adults in the classroom, providing rich language, getting down on their knees to ask questions of kids, getting kids to sort out and talk through their problems with peers. I mean, those caring adults who have skills and strong oral language proficiency is a key driver of kids' early growth.
Jeremy, I think you're muted. My apologies.
I did the thing again. All right. We're just about out of time here. And I want to be respectful of our panelists' time and our attendees' time. First, I want to thank everyone who attended here today. I hope this was helpful for you and your districts. If you have other questions you would like to ask, I'm going to place my email in the chat. And if it's something that we can't answer, we can field it to some of our panelists. And I also want to thank our panelists for their time, their expertise, and all of the work that went into planning this webinar here today. So thank you all so much for doing this. It's immensely helpful. And with that, we're going to conclude. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was our pleasure.